we can pretty well see that. Maybe we don't need to turn on lights. What do you want? Do you want intimate lighting, Russell?
I want the lights on.
Can we just get those? Whatever.
I don't know. No, we have to like get up and take the.
I want the lights both on and off at the same time. Quantum lights.
Well, your wave function is somewhere else in some universe with lights on.
Let's keep it off.
Okay. So I just want to do some quick accounting. So for one, I'd like to thank, Ben is not here for me to prove to him that I thanked him, but we'd like to thank Boltmate for housing us. They're super gracious, so thanks Boltmate. We certainly did not need to host us, and we are a little burdensome because we're very disorganized. Just joking. So yeah, that's great. I should say that they're also hiring developers actively, so if any of you are interested, you can probably talk to Steve or talk to Ben if he's here, or just talk to me and I'll put you in touch. They do lots of interesting work. When Steve and I started Intersections and we talked to Steve so that we would have a third person to come, one of the first people we had in mind to come and talk was Russell. We had looked at his thesis and said, let's get this person to talk, but I think we were too scared to contact him because we thought he'd hate us.
And I was like, I emailed it one time. It seems nice.
Did I miss it?
So yeah, so we're really excited for Russell to talk about type theory, and without further ado, here we go.
All right.
Sorry, I'm back.
What is dependent type theory? So, dependent type theory is a unification of logic, mathematics, and programming into a single language that allows you to do all three things at the same time, and so that's pretty awesome. If you like logic, mathematics, and/or programming, and so, right. So if we had a language that could unify logic, mathematics, and programming into a single language, why wouldn't everyone be using it instead of logic, mathematics, or programming separately? And the problem is that there is a price to be paid from each of the disciplines, and each of the prices seems absurdly high when it's stated this way, right? So logic has to give up unrestricted proof by contradiction, and hence logical completeness. Programming must give up unbounded search and Turing completeness, and just I didn't know really what to say for mathematics, so I said mathematics has to give up the axiom of choice. Right. And the truth of the matter is that it's not nearly as bad as all these 3 points sound, but each of the three people who might be interested in this unification think that it is not worthwhile giving up whatever aspect that they like about it. The truth of the matter, it is actually worth giving it up because the net result is so amazingly beautiful. But this is a big turnoff for some people. So some of you might just tune out now, and that's okay. But let's go on and try to understand what dependent type theory is, and entertain the notion that it might be worth whatever price you're going to have to pay to achieve it. So I had a bunch of slides like selling you on constructive math and stuff.
I'm sold.
That was hard to read. But let's get to the meat of the thing, right? All right, so there are two ways to approach it. Because it's a unification, you can approach it either from the logic math side or from the programming side. I am a logician, I think. I certainly approached it originally from the mathematical logical side, and that's the way I'm going to do the presentation. You can totally come at it from the other direction as well. But perhaps it's most closely aligned with the logical if we were to give sides. So let's just start simple with logic, right? So we're going to just have universal quantification for all, conjunction, which is your and, implication, true and false, right? As we'll start with this and we'll put more in later. And we're going to try to do logic with this. And there are several ways of doing logic, and one way of doing it is via natural deduction. And so logic is a game where you have a bunch of rules, and these are some of the rules of the game. They tell you how to create and through introduction rules and eliminate through elimination rules, these various logical constructs. So if you can derive A and you can derive B, then you have this rule called the AND deduction rule, which says you can put those two together, and then you can derive the single formula A and B. Also, complementary is that if you can derive A and B, there's one elimination rule that says from that you're allowed to derive A, and another elimination rule that says if you have shown A and B, you can derive B. This is the most famous logical rule over here, which says that if you can derive A implies B and you can derive A, then you are allowed to say that you can derive B. That's the implication elimination rule, also known as modus ponens, if you're like a Latin kind of person. And this is the most one of the most complicated rules, the implication introduction rule, and it says that if from some hypotheses A, we can derive B, then you're allowed to close off some set of those hypotheses of A, and you close them off by putting them in little square brackets, and you give the label so you can associate it with which rule you're closing it off with. Then you can derive A implies B. And when I work through some examples, you'll come to appreciate this complexity here. But this means that the rules don't necessarily form a simple tree because you have these like leaves that get closed off by these implication rules. And it sounds really wonky, but when we interpret this as programs, it will be like very familiar. We have a rule to get us. One of the rules that gets us started is that from nothing you can just derive true, and there's no elimination rule yet to go with it. And this is false over here. There's no rules that introduce false. But if you have false, then the elimination rules allow you to derive anything you want from it.
It's the Holy Grail.
And then we have a for all introduction rule and a for all elimination rule that works very similar to the implication rule. For instance, you can prove for all x, b of x, and you have some t of x, then you can prove b of t. And there's a similar introduction rule. All right, let's do a simple deduction, right? So we're going to start with the hypothesis that A and B and C, and then we can apply the first elimination rule for AND, so allowing us to derive the first component of that conjunction, which allows us to derive A and B, and then we're going to use the same rule again to derive A. So from A and B and C, we can derive A.
Let's publish.
Let's go a little bit more complicated. Again, starting from A and B and C, we can first derive A and B, and then we can use a second rule to derive B. And over here, from the same hypothesis, we can just use a second rule to derive C. And then we can, since we derived B and we derived C, we can use the introduction rule to derive A and C, put them together. And then we can take those two proofs that I just showed you, which I've just replaced here and over here, and then we can use the AND introduction on those two proofs to get A and B and C. And then for the final step, we're going to use the implication introduction rule. What we're going to do is we're going to close off our assumptions of A and B and C in all three locations. So we put them all together with the same label and square the bracket them off, and that allows us to use our introduction rule, implication introduction rule, which means now we have shown from no hypotheses, we've closed off all the hypotheses. From no assumptions, we can prove that A and B and C implies A and B and C. So this is sort of the association, the proof of associativity of conjunction. Or half of the proof. Yeah.
I probably missed this part. What was it about the label A that changed it from an assumption to not an assumption?
So for now, the label A is just saying allows us to tie which introduction rule over here are closed off the hypotheses.
Okay, so we're saying like, okay.
It's just simply a bookkeeping rule. Sometimes you don't even label them at all, right? But it'll be useful for later for them to have labels, so we know that this is a rule over here. That closed off those hypotheses over here.
Okay. Oh, okay, because we're implying such that it's true. Well, like given that it's true, this.
Yes.
So, okay. So,
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, right. So before, right? I just want to emphasize that, I guess. Before, this is a proof from the assumption that A and B and C, that we can conclude A and B and C. Right, but this proof here is from no assumption. We can prove this implication over here.
Right. Okay.
Here's another little proof. So we start with an open assumption B, which we will close later. But we would start with an open assumption B, and then we can use the introduction rule to prove that A implies B. And here we have this label A, and when I said that you can close off a set of assumptions, right, that set can also be the empty set, right? So here we close off the empty set of A assumptions, of which there are none, and we get A implies B for free. And it's actually okay, right? Because if you just have B, then you can have A implies B because B is just holds already, and you can add whatever assumptions you want to weaken things. Sorry, if you want. Okay. And then in the next step, we're going to take that open assumption B, label it with the B, close it off over here, and now we have from no assumptions that B implies A implies B. So this is another logical tautology. All right. So that little set of connectives I gave you is actually considered a logically complete set of connectives. So we can just define A, if and only B, to be A implies B and B implies A by definition. We can define negation by saying not A is defined to be A implies false. And if you work out the truth tables for that, you'll find that yes, this is a good definition of negation. You can come up with what I'm calling classical disjunction to distinguish it from a constructive disjunction we'll define later. By classical disjunction, A or classically B, we can just define to be not A, and not B. This is sort of DeMorgans Rule, and if you work it out logically with the truth tables, you'll find that this is in fact an OR statement. And we can play the same DeMorgan Rule to get the classical existential quantifier, so there classically exists on X, such that B of X, just by definition, means that not for all X, not B. Okay, I'm going to define a formula B. We're going to define it to be stable if it is the case that not B implies B, right? And so, according to classical logic, this not B implies B is tautology. This is the heart of proof by contradiction, which we're going to ask you to give up in a moment, right? But we can define those formulas for which we can apply. So just because we're going to give up eventually proof by contradiction doesn't mean that you can't always you can never use proof by contradiction, right? You can still use proof by contradiction on those formulas that are stable. Which formula are stable? Stability is preserved by all the connectives I've defined so far. Right, so if we just assume that all propositional variables are stable, then every formula that we can derive is stable, and we can use double negation, proof by contradiction on everything. And this is a little comment here about how the prevalence of stabilities. Stable formulas, even in constructive math, is like everywhere. So equality between integers or real numbers, even those are all stable formulas. Sorry. So just to prove that we haven't lost anything yet, Here's the proof of excluded middle, which is famously not provable supposedly not provable. And here we just assume not A and not A. We derive not A and not A from that assumption. We use mode exponents together to get false, and then put it together through the elimination rule. Anyhow, the net result is a proof that not A and not A. And if you work at this out, this is the same as A or classically not A. Right? And so as long as you're using the classical disjunction over here, we have excluded middle you can exclude the middle to your heart's content. All right. So now, we have those basic logical formulas. We're going to extend our language now by adding more connectives. These are the so-called, what I would call the constructive connectives. So this is the constructive disjunction. From A, we can prove A or B. From B, we can prove A or B. And here's the corresponding elimination rule, which again is sort of a little bit complicated. If we assume if we have A or B from some derivation, and from A we can derive some formula C, and from some B we can derive a formula C, then you can derive C. And this just means that we don't know, which of A and B holds, but no matter which one holds, we can still get to C, so it doesn't really matter, and you can just have your C. And sort of a similar rule for the constructive existence. If you have some sort of T of X such that B of T holds, then you can conclude that there exists some X where B of X holds, and the T is the answer. And if you have, you're assuming if you can prove that there exists some X such that B of X holds, and from some arbitrary X, and from some arbitrary, if for some arbitrary X you can prove B of X, and then from that you can derive C, then you can just make the C, right? So you can show that sort of B of X holds for any free variable X, so that you can plug anything into it and you can derive C no matter what that free variable is, then you can have your C for free.
Is that the same as saying if there exists an X such that B of X is true, and for all X show for all X B of X is true, and then from that you can derive C, then you can derive C?
Yes, that is basically what the rule is saying. All right. So the constructive disjunction and constructive existential create, these connectives do not preserve stability, right? So they create non-stable formulas even if the formulas input to them are stable. And this is where we give up our proof by contradiction. So in general, we can't use proof by contradiction because we might be using the constructive disjunction and constructive existential. We can't prove excluded middle using the constructive existential. We have to use the classical disjunction to prove excluded middle. So this is why constructive mathematics departs from classical mathematics, because classical mathematics doesn't have these constructive logical operators where we've expanded our language, and now the things that we've taken granted don't necessarily hold. All right, so our next step in our journey towards dependent type theory is to annotate our derivations with proof objects. And proof objects are these things here that we put on your left. And then we have a colon, and then we have the formula that U or V on the right. And all we're just going to do is we're going to annotate. We're going to annotate our proof deductions. And so if we have a proof of A, which is annotated by some expression P, and it's a proof of B, which is annotated by some expression Q, then we're going to, you can prove A and B, because that was one of our rules, and the annotation will be just the annotation from A paired with the annotation from B. For the elimination rules, we have this pi1 annotation for the first elimination rule and pi2 for the second rule. And the annotation, so let's do the elimination mode exponents first. If we have annotated F for A implies B and annotation P for A, then F, think of this as a syntax for function application, but it's just, think of it as abstract syntax. That's, suggestive. Function application, F and P is the annotation for introduction elimination. And then maybe dually here, right, the annotation for the introduction rule is going to be a lambda symbol followed by our label A, colon A, dot, and then the Q, the entire expression for Q. And this expression for Q probably has some occurrences of A in it because that A will be in the sub-expression that's sort of like counted down. It might not, but it probably does. And so there will be some A's over here. For the proof object for truth, we'll just put a flat. That'll be that. And then there's not a lot of, not necessarily a lot of good names for the elimination rule. Abort A. So telling you A, which A you got. This is something that I've seen in one place, but some people call it magic, and there are other names for it that are even worse. So this is the best one I have. And then the introduction rule for all. Again, the same lambda expression as for implication and the same function application for the elimination for all. And now we'll do our constructive objects, our constructive connectives. So sigma 1b. So we have to save the b over here because we have to tell it what the alternative that, because p tells us what is our proof object for A. And so our proof object for A or B has to tell us what that other or is on the other side. So we have to label with B here so we know what we're talking about. And similarly for Q, it's sigma 2, and then we have to tell it what the A is that we're, because from Q we can derive A or B, or C or B, or D or B, and then we have to like inform you which one we've decided we're going to pick on. We have this elaborate expression here for or elimination called case for or. R of, and then we take our label A and stick it over here and put up arrow and P, V, arrow Q, and the point is that we just put all the pieces of information together in some sort of abstract syntax. And for existential, it's the same as it's a pairing thing, and then we have this other case elimination. So let's take a look at our proof that we had before. And we'll put all the annotations on it everywhere, right? So we have our A annotated over here. It's just annotated with the label that will be closed off later. And so we get pi1A over here, and then we get pi1 of A because we put another layer of pi1s on it. Here we have pi2 of pi1 and pi2 over there. We've coupled them together over here because we're using the introduction rule and another introduction rule over here. And then a big lambda for our implication introduction rule that closes off those hypotheses over here. But the cool thing is that once we've done all that annotation, we actually don't need the entire tree anymore because we can basically read it off from the annotation that we put on it, because the annotation sort of encodes all of that deduction that we did in our tree, and you can sort of just read it off the annotation that we put it together. So from now on, we'll ignore the trees, and we'll just focus on the annotations themselves as little bits of expressions. Right, so this would be considered the proof as a proof object. So this is the proof of this theorem over here.